I decided that really what I wanted to do was ask colleagues to participate in a discussion, because the reason I came to UConn last year was because there's so many very interesting people here who are working on important projects coming from lots of different kinds of perspectives, and I wanted to give the audience an opportunity to interact with the talent that I get to interact with, and the people who I feel like I will learn and grow with and from while I'm at UConn. The group of faculty and students and staff who are collecting themselves under the umbrella of educator quality in the school and in the university, we're representatives of that group. It's a large and growing group. We welcome anyone to join us, and I could have just as easily asked several dozen other faculty and staff to join us in this presentation. So I'm hoping that perhaps this is the first of a series of presentations and colloquia that the school can have about the very important issue of how we as a school of education help support and do good work for the educators of Connecticut and for the country. So I want to start with just a big picture view of some of the landscape that we're going to cover today. Teachers and leaders in schools are working in a cacophonous, impassioned environment. There are more discussions having to do with education and teachers and leaders in schools in this country at the national and international level than perhaps ever before. Or maybe it's because we live in a digital world, we just get bombarded with all of this information in a new and different kind of way. But among the things that educators and leaders and teachers have to deal with in schools are things like changing expectations for curriculum as represented in the Common Core state standards, rising accountability. This has been a message for close to 20 years now, but takes the form of new assessments that teachers have never seen and have to work on thinking about how to prepare their students for and teach to and around in meaningful ways. There are new expectations for teacher evaluation. There are models that say that they can calculate our value as people. There are teacher evaluation systems that calculate a value for a teacher, for a school, for a teacher education program. There are changing expectations about where teachers should be prepared and who should teach them and what they should know and what their qualifications are. There are changing expectations about early teacher career support and for professional development, and ideas about who should provide professional development and what teachers should be required to do over the course of their career. It's just a whirlwind of different kinds of policies, and the messages from those policies are not always resonant. It can be there can be lots of conflicting messages in that system. At the same time, people who are in schools know that they're dealing with a lot of the churn that just is represented by being a school in a community. The student population in this country continues to grow and change and become more and more diverse, and teachers are challenged to work with children who are very different than themselves and who are full of wonderful ideas and lots of energy, but sometimes difficult to manage. So schools are complicated, busy, noisy, exciting, sometimes debilitating places because of the challenges associated with them, and all of the faculty and students and staff who I've met at Neag are really interested in thinking about policies and programs and practices that can help and support those teachers. So Dorothea is going to start us with a sort of historical and contemporary overview of conceptions of good teachers, and then we'll go to Sarah, and then to Rachael, and then to Morgaen.
So I want to provide a very brief and necessarily really rough historical overview of notions of good teaching. I have like 5 minutes to cover about 200 years, so let's get ready to go. I will talk fast. I would say before I start though, I mean, what an amazing example of what a good teacher is that we just came from. Yes. I mean, if every teacher could be as remarkable as Caitlin, I mean, this world would be a totally different place. And I think we're all very blessed to even have been in that room and listened to that experience. And I know Doug Kaufman has been her advisor, and how tremendously, overwhelmingly proud you must feel of Caitlin. So I'm going to kind of run roughshod over 200 years, like I said, of notions of good teaching that Americans have held. And while there's lots of shifts and changes in these notions, there are some kind of enduring challenges and concerns that have always been present. And some of these concerns relate to questions of what are teachers' appropriate relationships with the communities that they serve? What should teachers know in order to be able to teach well? How should teachers balance the demands between the social control purposes of schooling and those purposes about caring and nurturing young people's social, emotional, and academic development? And finally, what are teachers' roles in terms of these questions of quality and equality? So I want to take you back in time now to the first beginnings of kind of the common school movement, the expansion of public schools in the United States. And here the vision of teaching, really, good teachers were seen as community role models. Teachers' behavior, both public and private, was extremely regulated. There's a notion of a very moralistic notion of teachers. So teachers were expected to live in the communities that they served and actually live with the students and the citizens. Teachers were prohibited from smoking. They were prohibited from playing pool, from loitering in ice cream parlors. The women were prohibited from cutting their hair. The men could not get shaved in a barbershop. Women teachers were prohibited from marrying. And this is from a contract in actually 1905 from Ohio, which I think is kind of interesting, that women teachers who marry or engage in other unseemly conduct would be dismissed. Men teachers, courting was highly regulated as well. So early days of American schooling, obviously teachers were considered very moral paradigms in very constricted terms. But there's always also a concern for what should teachers know? Teachers should know their subject matter pretty well. So even in the early days of teacher certification, teachers were asked to pass tests on all of the subject matters that they would teach. So during the this is where I roughshod, and I apologize to historians. So in the 1850s through the early 1900s, this was a period where teaching was becoming women's work. The schoolmen and the men who are on the boards of education sought to fill teaching all the new classes that we needed, cheap labor, young women. But also at this time, there's new emerging ideas of what a good teacher was. It was not just a moralistic paragon of moralistic notions. It was also someone who now could nurture children. And women were looked at as models for how to do this. At the same time, we had other notions of good teaching. This was in response to the massive social changes that were going on. Massive amounts of immigration, industrialization, urbanization, and of course, westward expansion and the decimation of Native American communities and their forced relocation. Good teachers now were looked at to be both models and agents for Americanization. And this Americanization, of course, was defined very narrowly in terms of white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant norms. So why that? These processes of Americanization could be often quite brutal and oppressive. There's also countervailing notions of teachers as agents for social justice. We see this exemplified in W.E.B. Du Bois's idea of what an African-American teacher could fulfill. African-American teachers were looked on to be models and agents of racial uplift for their community. At the turn of the century, women teachers were becoming radicalized. They were fighting against their own oppression in the system, and they were leading the movements to unionize teaching. Many of these women teachers, like Ella Flagg, they were promoting a new notion of teachers, a new idea that good teachers actually were seeking social progress and seeking policies that would ameliorate poverty that their students faced. Progressive educators like Dewey picked up on these ideas of social justice and equality and promoted an idea of good teaching as supporting, fostering students' capacities for critical thinking and their capacities to become themselves democratic participants in our society. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. So I took a break. I said, okay, 1930s, relative calm. However, again, with the 1960s, the movement now for racial justice and racial segregation now exposed kind of underlying ongoing tensions between white teachers and the communities of color that they increasingly served. So now questions again arose of what is a proper relationship between teachers and their communities that they serve. And finally, from the 1970s to the present, we've seen the rise of the accountability movement. Forces of standardization, performance measures. And I would argue that now our notions of good teaching have become what I would consider fairly narrow. Now we're defining good teaching pretty much only in terms of effectiveness. And we're measuring that effectiveness solely in terms of standardized test scores. So all of our concerns that we've historically had about teachers' role in their community, teachers' role in the social and emotional development of their students, teachers' role in helping to think about and work towards more justice in that environment beyond the schools, have been constrained now to a very narrow notion of good teaching as effectiveness. So I want to end just with putting out a more expansive notion of what we can think of as good teaching. And that looks both backwards and looks forward. And I just urge us to think about teaching as moral practice, not in terms of not going to ice cream parlors, but now thinking about teachers who are effective, who can promote their students' academic achievement, teachers who are responsive, who can respond to the diverse needs and interests of their students, and finally, teachers who think consciously and are critically aware of the issues of equity, both in their classrooms and beyond.
Thank you, Dorothea. This morning, I'm going to talk a bit about the intersection between policy, teachers and teaching, and learning, both for students as well as for educators. And it's quite likely that I'll raise more questions than provide solutions or answers, though I do hope that it's from a positive and optimistic place. I'd also like to start by sharing that not all policies that we think of as education policies actually deal with curriculum and instruction in really rich and robust ways, and that is a new development for education policy. And it's something that we need to think carefully about how policies are addressing and framing teachers and teachers' work. And second, that even for policies that do deal with curriculum and instruction, such as the new wave accountability policies that Dorothea and Suzanne both kind of hinted at, we need to think really carefully about what's their potential to move into schools and through the classroom door to improve the quality of instruction, particularly for low-income and minority students. So I'd like to start with that point and then do the 24-second review of what is education policy. So education policy is able to set rules that can guide school systems. And these policies can be created at the federal, state, and at local levels. There are arguments that even teachers and most definitely principals and other leaders within schools can be creating their own policies. Secondly, education policy contains ideas about what's appropriate and what may be effective, both structures and practices for schooling. And so those structures and practices might be new curricula, they might be new ways of organizing schools, whether formation of magnet schools or charter schools, different ways of hiring teachers. All of these are structures and practices that are setting forth definitions about what is the right way and what is the good way to create a good school and a good teacher. And education policy ultimately is attempting to promote change in a particular direction. So it's an effort by legislators, by reformers, by practitioners, again, at different levels of the system, to move systems and move people and move teaching, perhaps, in one direction versus another. So as I talk about policies and about the way they're shaping teachers and teaching and how we think about teachers and teaching, I'm going to use two cases very briefly today that fall under the umbrella of this new wave accountability system. So, and these are teacher evaluation systems many of which were promoted by ideas that were contained within Race to the Top, which was sort of the second wave. We have No Child Left Behind, and then we moved into the Race to the Top phase, and within that, states were encouraged to develop more robust teacher evaluation systems. And then the second case that I'll use will be the Common Core state standards. So I want us to keep in mind, and it's important for researchers and practitioners to keep in mind the way that policy is something that teachers can learn about, and that policy is interacting with teachers in many ways, and that there's agency within teachers' engagement with policy. So teachers occupy an important role in which they can engage with the policy environment. They can learn these ideas from policy in various ways, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But the agency that's in policy and that is in formal education policy related to curriculum and instruction and other aspects of teaching can be interpreted and enacted by teachers. And that interpretation and that enactment can go in many different ways, depending on teachers' pre-existing beliefs, the practices, where they were developed as educators, where they're currently teaching, who they are, their background. All of these things shape the way that they make sense of policy and the way they interpret policy and the ideas of policy. And then there's another step where once teachers have interpreted policy in a particular way, they have hundreds, if not thousands, of choices about exactly how they're going to enact them. What are their day-to-day work practices going to look like as a result of the policy? And so there are multiple ways to understand policy, and as a consequence of that, sometimes teachers change along certain dimensions of a policy, and other times teachers do not change or change in different ways. And there are different ways of thinking about these degrees of change. And it's important, again, for us to consider that when there's one policy, there's so many ideas within it that teachers are attempting to respond to. And I'd like to make the argument that teachers are learning either way. So if they are rejecting particular ideas about a policy, they're still learning about that policy, and they're still learning about their practice and about what works or what may not work for them within a particular context. So it's important to find ways to think through and to analyze and to understand how and why teachers are learning about these policies, even if the change is not necessarily in the direction that the policymakers, the reformers, were initially intending. So I'd like us to think through both what are teachers learning from these new wave accountability policies, as well as how teachers are learning from these new wave accountability policies. So first, what exactly are teachers learning from teacher evaluation and Common Core? And I shared kind of a few ideas, and these are things that it would be great to study in more depth and really think through. But I think when it comes to Common Core, teachers are being reminded and are getting a lot of messages about how the way that teaching common standards is appropriate. And that's setting forth teachers and teachers' work in a particular way. They're also getting a lot of ideas and perhaps learning about the relationship between teaching and assessment. And that's not a new thing. That's something that started with No Child Left Behind and is continuing as we move towards Common Core and the match between Common Core and Smarter Balance. When it comes to teacher evaluation, teachers are learning a lot about the ways in which teaching can and perhaps should be measured. With both strengths and limitations to that sort of measurement and to that sort of evaluation. And finally, they're learning, again through teacher evaluation, they're getting a lot of ideas and perhaps learning about the ways that different forms of teaching are privileged or are valued by these evaluation practices and instruments and rubrics. And I want to clarify that I'm not saying that these are the things that teachers should be learning or that every teacher is learning these exact messages, but in thinking through the ideas and the conceptualizations that are really packed into these policies, these are some of the things that policies I think are starting to teach teachers, again, with both strengths and limitations for both teachers and for schools as a whole. So something that I think is important for us to think about as we consider teachers and their interactions with policy is how exactly are teachers learning about policy? And my argument is that teachers are learning about policy from a lot of different sources in a lot of different ways, and different teachers have different access to these policy ideas. And if we're serious again about change, and if we're serious about the potential to use policy as one sort of lever, again, to improve educational outcomes and to increase the opportunities available, again, particularly for low-income and minority students, we need to think about how teachers are accessing ideas from policy and how educators at different levels of the system are learning about policy. So educator preparation programs are one place where teachers can learn about the policy system and about policies that are currently in place. Professional development, which sometimes is still stuck in the one day, one shot, here's your PowerPoint, here's how you do teacher evaluation, here's what counts as a Common Core lesson. And teachers are also learning about policy through collaboration structures. Well-led professional learning communities or data team meetings are ways for teachers to do some of the policy work and do some of the implementation together as a group and learn from and with one another. The teachers are also learning more and more from books, journals, and other resources. Many teachers purchase their own practitioner resource materials that have ideas about implementing the best Common Core lessons or ways to structure behavior and things like that within their classroom. And finally, I think a promising area that it would be good for researchers and for school leaders to think more about is the way teachers are learning about policy through both media and social media. And in particular, in the case of the new wave accountability policies, teacher evaluation and Common Core is constantly in the Washington Post, the New York Times, The Current. We're seeing this as front page stories. We're seeing it week in and week out, both with advocacy pieces as well with in-depth reporting. Books are coming out that are showing what it's like to be a teacher. And teachers are learning and getting ideas about the policy and making sense of the policy through those different media sources. And social media is a place where, on my Facebook feed, I've noticed different folks they're sharing news articles, but they're also sharing their reactions to things such as Common Core. So I've seen several Facebook status messages that inform I've decided to write an opt-out letter for Common Core testing for my child. And that's something that 10, 20 years ago was not a way that teachers or other members of the public were learning or thinking about policy. So I'd like to conclude by sharing a riff on Ball and Cohen's instructional triangle, and I call it the policy learning triangle. And in this triangle, I'm trying to show that district and school leaders, as well as teacher leaders, have a role and a responsibility in teaching teachers about policy. And that policy is the stuff and can be part of the content that teachers learn. And obviously this happens within a broader context and again is filtered through teachers' own prior experiences. But when we think about policy, it's one more aspect of teaching and teachers' work that we have a responsibility to support teachers in their learning and their development about. So thank you.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you, Suzanne. And I'm really excited to talk to you quickly about this today. So this was the question that I came to the panel with. And I wanted to start just with the assertion that without powerful professional education for in-service teachers, the impact of well-intentioned preparation programs and policies is always going to be minimal. And although this may be unpopular, especially in this setting, I'm going to tell you about why. I want to talk with you about why I think policy and preparation won't change much about teaching. And again, as I said, the thesis I'd like to assert is that without powerful professional education for in-service teachers, we're not going to get very far no matter what preparation or policy does. And one of the reasons I think that is that even if we are preparing really good teachers, we just have some logistics problems in terms of the relative strength or impotence of preparation to make changes in classroom teaching. So if we think about the number of pre-service teachers going into the teaching force every year, it's fewer than 3% at a time. Very, very few of them are coming from our program, which is an example of a high-performing program. So we know that candidates from high-performing teacher prep programs are coming in at a pretty slow trickle. If we want to change teaching, we have to engage with practicing teachers. There's really no way around it. And one of the reasons there's no way around it is because teachers have their most intensive, sustained, and formative development in school settings, not in teacher prep programs. So by February of their first year of teaching, our graduates have already spent more time in classrooms as teachers than they did as candidates across 3 years in our program. We hope they do stay that long, till February, but we know, and longer, hold on guys. But we know that good candidates trickle in, but they often pour out, especially in high-need schools. So this has led lots of people to ask if accountability policies would help fix teacher prep. And yes, of course they will. For example, because of new state policies, my syllabus now needs to have the words phonics, dyslexia, and text complexity on it to prove that I will address these things instead of or in addition to whatever it was that I was addressing before in my reading methods class. But that's just a syllabus, so it's okay. Syllabi don't matter much, but teacher prep programs can, if we let them. So this image of the ivory tower in the trenches should be offensive to both sides. They should be, because schools of education and K-12 schools want and need each other for learning. We need braided, fiber optic, titanium strength networks of connections. something like, but not limited to, this lovely picture of a professional learning community meeting between high school teachers and Neag researchers. You can see John Sutledge in that picture and in the back. There's a slide for you later, John. So, as Sarah said, we need each other, especially where policies are involved, because research tells us that teachers and professors alike tend to hug the middle when it comes to making changes based on policy messages. And one of the real reasons for hugging the middle is that even though all of these new wave policies claim to focus on improving teacher quality, the mechanism for teacher development is either under-theorized or completely unspecified. I want to show you an example of what I mean in Connecticut with our new teacher evaluation policy. I've highlighted the parts that are important to me. So even though this policy claims to focus solely on teacher quality, we only refer to the process of measuring it and assume that it'll be just simple. Once we've measured it, we can fix it by slapping some PD on. However, as somebody that spends a lot of time working with practicing teachers, I'm left wondering what PD, when, where, how much, from whom, in what ways. But on any given day in the last 3 years, PD has mostly been focused on delivering information about new policies, not improving teaching and learning. Now, that isn't to say that we don't know how to do good PD for developing teachers. We do have some examples of these, but they are few, far between, and on a small scale. We could work with some of the things that they have in common as a basis for growing them and think about how they position teachers as professionals and ask them to extend their knowledge. However, at the moment, we have new wave policies that are focused almost exclusively on accountability. So just like with students, instead of investing in knowledge and networks and context for professional learning, we're investing in testing to prove to everybody what teachers don't know. And then instead of using evaluation to design new kinds of teacher professional development, we use professional development time to do new evaluation paperwork. This is for you, John. Greatness is not built. I'm sorry, it is built. It's not poured. We should be thinking about not pouring good teachers into a system or pouring good things on top of teachers in a system. We should be thinking about building greatness within a system. And I think that we should think about great for 3 reasons. Here's number 1. We don't know what good is. We don't know if it's single or multiple. We don't know if it changes. We don't know if good means the same thing for all teachers or all students or all settings or all teacher by student by setting interactions. It may be that the good teacher is an elk we just haven't tracked yet with our measurement tools. It may be a stag, rather, that we haven't tracked yet with our measurement tools. It may even be a unicorn that doesn't exist out there pure and serene to be measured by our tools. The other reason that we should care about great instead of good and building great instead of pouring in good is that great is a lot better than good. So look at the phrases that we use to talk about good teachers that we can prepare or legislate. We can legislate that they are mandated reporters. We can prepare people who are safe enough to practice and who are reflective practitioners, but that just basically means if they know there's a problem, they'll try and fix it. I don't think that's good enough. The third reason is that greatness is about process, not stuff. Those are pictures of policies that give us more stuff. But we should be really obsessed with the process, what teachers do, not what they come with. Current policies really are just about stuff, but standards don't teach kids, evaluations don't teach kids, tests don't teach kids, interactions, actions, and reactions teach kids, so we should be interested, come on thinker, in thinking. Are the thinkers thinking? Are the readers reading? Are the writers writing? Are the teachers teaching? And if not, stop the engines and the reforms and the PowerPoints and become obsessed with the actions and interactions and the reactions between people in schools. Is the stuff of policies in the way? Is it enabling or constraining? Is it pressuring or supporting? And this is my last slide. This is a picture that I took of myself with the Real Thinker statue a few months ago. Now, it's a terrible picture, but it was a wonderful day, and I'll tell you why. I learned a lot getting lost and found in 3 languages and 2 modalities on the way to this museum where the thinker lives. And although I don't remember any of the relevant metrics, I don't remember how far I went, I don't remember how long it took, I don't remember the address of the museum, but I know I'm a better navigator now than before I engaged in the work of navigation. So if teacher prep wants to reform, we should engage more deeply and consistently with the work of teaching. If evaluators want to evaluate, they need to also engage with the work of teaching because it'll change how they see teaching and learning. And if we want teachers to develop, we'll have to keep the focus on processes of teaching and learning, not the politicized, sanitized stuff that we put on top of teaching and learning when we have to write it all out on official documents. Thank you.
So I'm Morgaen Donaldson, and I Rachael and I do a lot of work together, and that's because we complement each other. So I have one slide, and it's sort of like shaker furniture. It's bare bones minimalist. So Yahoo for collaboration. So over time and currently, individuals and organizations have advanced different conceptions of teaching. And I emphasize teaching because I'm focusing on the interactions and the processes that Rachael talked about. And I also see my portion of this presentation as circling back to where Dorothea started out, with an eye towards history and change or stability over time. These conceptions of teaching are embedded in policies that in turn shape the day-to-day work of teachers and the broader nature of the profession. They also shape the definitions and opportunities for teachers to exercise leadership. And that's the particular topic that I'll focus on today. So over time, I argue that there are three main conceptions of teaching that keep recurring. One is teaching as a profession, the second is teaching as labor, and the third is teaching as volunteerism. Policies tend to, on the surface, embrace one or more of these, and as such, cast teaching and teacher leadership in a different light. So starting with teaching as a profession, in the teaching as profession framework, teaching is challenging intellectual work. And good teaching in this paradigm is the result of deep and comprehensive and rigorous preparation and a commitment on the part of the teacher to continuously reflect, pursue greater knowledge, and improve his or her practice over time. Because teachers are viewed as professionals, teacher leadership has a very strong position in this framework. As professionals, teachers have an intellectual and expertise-based claim to exercising leadership. And professionals ought to play a critical role in shaping their own profession after all. And teachers as professionals have a right to that claim. Expertise is valued, and those teachers who are the most expert are the most qualified for leadership positions. So we see evidence of policies that endorse this view of teaching, in policies that create differentiated roles for teachers, in policies that create opportunities for teachers to create and lead professional development and curriculum development, and have a key voice in decision making at the school and at the district level, even at the state or federal level. So in the current context, the Common Core creates some of these opportunities, or at least has the potential to create these opportunities. And in districts which embrace this teacher as professional viewpoint, they really enlist teachers as the main drivers of Common Core implementation. So notice that I say in districts that embrace this view, because it's not just the policies. It's not just a matter of the policies dictating one perspective or another. It's what happens at the local level to pick up these messages and really transform them into practice. So examples of places that have really embraced this are Montgomery County, Maryland, where they have multiple teacher leadership roles, and teachers take an active role in authoring curriculum, but many of the policies in the district. So in the second framework, in the teaching as labor framework, teaching is treated as rationalized and routine work. Good teaching in this framework is teaching that accomplishes the critical tasks defined by management. Because teaching is labor and more or less similar from classroom to classroom, egalitarianism is prized. The belief that all teachers hold equal status and no teacher should be prized above another is the primary message. So as such, teacher leadership roles in some ways threaten the essence of what it means to be a teacher. To hold a teacher leadership role and presume to lead other teachers violates the teacher as laborer framework. Moreover, strict divisions between labor and management mean that teacher leadership kind of threatens that sort of status quo in the organization. So when a teacher assumes a leadership position but remains a teacher, he or she threatens the balance between labor and management, which has existed sometimes uneasily for decades. So we see evidence of the teaching as labor paradigm in current policies that evaluate teachers with very little input from teachers. So for example, teacher evaluation systems that evaluate teachers based solely on value-added measures, which are completely external to teachers, and administrator observations perpetuate that view of teaching as labor. And in the third primary conception, the paradigm of teaching as volunteerism, teaching is conserved as service work, as missionary work. So good teaching here is measured by effort and self-sacrifice. Like the teaching is labor framework, teaching as volunteerism doesn't have a clear place for teacher leadership or a formal place for teacher leadership. So while those who give most selflessly are cherished, there's a sense that potentially formally recognizing those people might undermine or diminish the worth of their work. So we see evidence of teaching as volunteerism in paradigm in policies that expand charter schools and ease teacher certification and preparation requirements. With a few notable exceptions, teacher leadership in these charter settings is not a primary consideration of either the policies or the programs they foster. So each conception of teaching is embedded in policies and suggests various models of teacher leadership. But as I alluded to earlier, policies vary, and through implementation, different conceptions can be endorsed. So I think I'll end by asking two questions. One is, what conception or blend of conceptions do you think is most beneficial to teachers? Which one is most beneficial, or blend of ones is most beneficial to children? And what can you do to advance this conception or blend of conceptions?
I'll start by saying that, yes, sometimes policies are imposed on teachers. And part of the notion of the policy learning triangle is to think of ways to make sure that we're setting up teachers to be able to be strategic and agentic while they are implementing these policies. And that it's in the implementation that they're doing the policy and they're changing the policy and they're modifying the policy. And in that way, they have a huge amount of, in many cases, they have a huge amount of discretion and space to be making their own practice. A second part of that is that there are times when teachers do have opportunities to make policy and to create policy within their grade level teams, within other structures at the school. Sometimes they're pulled in by districts to create policy by writing curriculum, by fleshing out the relationship between the Common Core standards and other aspects of reform and of what that actually looks like in practice. So I think those are sort of two places where, yes, they are sort of receiving messages, but then they are also having opportunities to implement those messages, and it's in that implementation that they're learning more about the policy, and oftentimes that can drive their policy making as well.
And I think you raised a really great question, sort of implicit question, which is, what is policy? And in the way that I think about it, policy is anything that a teacher is in a systematic way a teacher is asked to do. So the Common Core is on the books. In a technical sense, it's a policy. But then the way it's experienced by teachers and leaders, et cetera, is as a program. And so, and they're different, I think, decision points. I think it goes back to this question of choice. How does a district and how does a school decide to engage with Common Core? And even to Sarah's point, how does a teacher as an individual decide to engage with Common Core? And we see very different models of how different organizations and individuals engage with it. And I think to all the students in the class, in the room, my suggestion is really engage with it as an author. Because you are the leader of your own classroom. And so don't wait for someone else to tell you how to do it. You make your own meaning. And I'm sure I'm echoing a lot of what's shared in the teacher ed program, but I think that's the way to not only make it work for you, but to make a career out of this wonderful thing called teaching.
I want to kind of expand the conversation a little bit here and think about the power of teachers working with the families and the communities that they serve to speak back and to author policy. I'm going to give an example of the most recent teacher strike in Chicago, which happened just a couple years ago. And that was a strike against many of these accountability policies. And over the past few decades, really, I think that people who are promoting many of these policies have really positioned teachers as their teachers' interest as being in opposition to the interests of students and their families. And I think that is something that teachers and families have to start changing that discourse. And the Chicago Teachers Union strike was an example of that. The teachers union had a very tense relationship with the communities that they served. But what the teachers union started doing most recently over the past few years is really working with the community to educate the parents and community members about what policies we're actually doing in their schools and to their children. And when the teachers went on strike, the parents and those communities totally supported those teachers. And it was an entirely different situation that had occurred in the late 1990s when the teachers and the parents were totally at odds. And so I think we need to think about moving not just in our classrooms, but teachers' role as representing and serving their communities and working with their communities. I think that we have to make sure that our students know what's happening out there. They go into the schools and they talk to their teachers. The teachers in the schools are the best educators that they have, particularly around these policies. I do think it's a matter, particularly now, in terms of this whole measurement push. I think we have to arm our students with understanding these issues of measurement. Because ultimately, part of our problem as teachers and teacher educators is that we haven't really found good representations of our teaching. And so people who have numbers and who have measures, they can come in and say, oh, this is what teaching is. We can measure it. We can put a chart in the newspaper and people will say, oh, that must be a sign of teaching, right? And so I don't really have the answers for this. And I think we just have to be honest with the students and try to engage them with us and try to arm them with the kind of moral commitments of teaching with and for your students. And if we can help foster that deep moral connection between students and teachers, that I think then they can face the battles.
But I do also think that this speaks to the imperative for universities to have partnerships with schools, because the people who are in classrooms 24/7 do not have the time or necessarily the expertise that's needed to come up with the alternative, powerful representations of practice. And schools of education have a moral responsibility to the schools to be working on the development of different kinds of ways of measuring in a robust way and showing that people are good teachers to speak back to this. So, yeah, yes.
I think that I'm understanding your question right. I've been working a lot with teachers in a high school as they transition to the new teacher evaluation policy. And my line to them about what to do when the measures they're asked to collect don't actually match their vision of teaching is punt and redirect. So by that I mean, I think that this is sort of an illustration of what you're talking about, that I can go and sort of act as a mediator between the language of the policy and be sort of a policy constructor with them to make sure that they understand how much room they have to make their goals, for example, actually match their teaching. And then if they don't know the measure that makes that goal a measurable goal, then I will find it for them or make it for them, and all of a sudden it's official because a professor said so. But so punt as in we're going to sort of fulfill this requirement, but it really only is just a requirement, and the spirit behind what you were trying to do as an aviation teacher or as a career and technical education teacher or as an English teacher is really always preservable. You just have to have the tools to explain what you're doing to other people. And often teachers don't have the resources to create or name those tools even when they have them, but we do. And so that's part of the responsibility that I feel to that group.
So the person with the hook on the stage came in. Well, so I've been hooked. First, I want to thank the prospective teachers in the room for demonstrating your commitment to the profession by giving up your Saturday morning to come. Thank you. I want to also thank everyone for coming, and as representatives of the educator quality group in the Neag School of Education, we welcome you to join us in our ongoing deliberations. Thank you. Go get your picture taken.